All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 18th Needham Healthcare Conference. I'm glad you could join us today. We have Rhythm Pharmaceuticals with us to present next. We have Hunter Smith, CFO, and Nithya Desikan, your position, Chief Commercial Officer, sir. I'm going to hand it over to Hunter right now to give us an update and overview of the company.
Thanks so much, Alan, and it's a real pleasure to be here at Needham again this year. First of all, before I start, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be making forward-looking statements during this presentation. Actual events or results could differ materially from those expressed here, and we specifically disclaim any obligation to update or revise any of these forward-looking statements. Rhythm is developing new medicines for people living with rare genetic disorders of obesity that result in severe early-onset obesity and hyperphagia. Rhythm is a pathway company. We're focused on diseases caused by genetic defects in the melanocortin-4 or MC4R pathway, where our drug setmelanotide has the potential to serve as replacement therapy. To date, Rhythm has achieved proof of concept in 4 rare disorders, all with breakthrough designation from the FDA and prime designation from the EMA, and we're advancing setmelanotide in 3 pivotal studies, with top-line data in our most advanced indications expected in the third quarter of this year, and our first NDA filings expected to follow in late 2019 or early 2020. We'll also talk today about the Rhythm Engine, which is an integrated set of programs designed to increase awareness, genetic testing, and ultimately treatment for patients living with these disorders. The Rhythm Engine is critical to our success. The hunger and weight gain experienced by patients with rare genetic disorders of obesity is remarkably different from any of the experiences most of us have had with hunger or weight gain. These conditions impact every aspect of patients' lives, frequently causing disabling comorbidities and with a very poor quality of life. On this slide, we depict Katie's story. Katie is a patient with heterozygous deficiency obesity. She weighed 450 pounds at age 23, double her weight at age 11. And below these photos, you can see listed some of the comorbidities she experiences: depression, asthma, agonizing back pain, sleep apnea. All of these come with severe obesity. But if you talk to Katie or you listen to her tell her story, what she really talks about is the extreme unrelenting hunger and excessive eating that occurs. It's a desperate need to eat. What her quote says, "As a child, the fridge and food was controlled massively, but nobody could understand that I was desperately hungry and just wanted to stop that feeling." These cases of obesity are simply different. Now, the MC4 pathway, which has been studied for several decades, is the critical pathway for regulating weight and hunger. The pathway is located in the hypothalamus of the brain, and it controls satiety, or the feeling that you're full, and it also regulates energy expenditure. Slide number 5 depicts the physiological action of the pathway. In a normal individual, a series of actions produce a neurotransmitter called alpha-MSH, which activates the MC4 receptor, leading to the feeling of satiety and an increase in resting energy expenditure. In individuals with genetic defects in the upstream of the MC4 receptor, alpha-MSH is not produced or does not bind to the receptor, and the pathway is inactive, leading to hyperphagia, or voracious hunger, as well as severe and early-onset obesity. Rhythm's drug, setmelanotide, steps in at the last stage of this pathway and binds to the MC4 receptor, thereby rescuing the function of the MC4 pathway. And as you'll see in a moment, setmelanotide has shown great efficacy in rescuing genetic disorders in the POMC, LEPR, PCSK1, Bardet-Biedl, and Alström genes. But we believe there are many potential genetic targets upstream of the MC4 receptor that we can target that impair MC4 pathway function and therefore represent potential targets for setmelanotide therapy. Now let's get into more detail on the development of setmelanotide. Setmelanotide is a potential first-in-class MC4 agonist. It's an 8-amino acid peptide with high potency, administered by once-daily subcutaneous injection. We are also working on a once-weekly formulation, which is beginning phase 2 studies. That formulation is being developed in conjunction or in partnership with Camurus, a Swedish company. The setmelanotide has been tried in over 330 patients, and we've demonstrated statistically significant weight loss across a wide variety of groups, and it has favorable tolerability. We have IP with composition of matter in all major markets, and in the U.S. with possible Hatch-Waxman extension to 2032. I talked before about the Rhythm Engine, and one foundational aspect of the Rhythm Engine is our phase 2 basket study. This study design, more commonly associated with oncology, enables Rhythm to enroll patients with genetic defects in the MC4R pathway genes as we encounter them through work with our investigators, as well as through our genetic sequencing efforts. As a result, studying new pathway defects is highly efficient under this protocol. We've already moved 4 indications from the basket study into phase 3 and are currently studying 2 more, het obesity and POMC epigenetic obesity. And we plan to study numerous others. As we continue to enroll patients with new MC4 pathway disorders in the basket study, we will provide updates to our investors as the year progresses. Now let's review some of the efficacy data that we've shown in phase 2. In each of our indications, today, we'll be reviewing the first patient that we treated. However, in our S1 or in our 10K business section, we list all patients that we've treated for these indications, so you can see the full case study of the data. Now, on each chart on the left-hand side of this particular slide, you will see our first POMC patient. On the chart, the orange line tracks weight change in kilograms against the left-hand vertical axis, and the green dotted line tracks hunger score against the right-hand vertical axis. As you can see, this patient saw a dramatic decrease in hunger after initiating therapy, from a 9 to less than a 1, and rapidly lost weight. After 12 weeks, she was withdrawn from therapy per protocol. Her hunger rebounded immediately, and she quickly regained 5 kilograms. Subsequently, we received approval to extend her treatment, and her hyperphagia and weight reduction and weight loss continued. This patient, and she ultimately lost over 40% of body weight. This patient has now been on therapy for over 4 years. We enrolled 1 additional patient in with POMC obesity who experienced comparable results. And we took these results, we published them in the New England Journal of Medicine. We took them to the FDA, which gave us breakthrough designation, and told us to proceed directly to phase 3. We fully enrolled our phase 3 study in this indication and expect to report top-line results in the 3rd quarter. On the right-hand side, you can see the results of our first leptin receptor patient with leptin receptor deficiency obesity. Our first patient lost over 20% of body weight in less than a year on treatment. We enrolled 2 additional patients in phase 3 who had similar results. We published those results in Nature Medicine. We took them to the FDA. Similar to the POMC story, the FDA gave us breakthrough designation and told us to proceed directly to phase 3. That study is fully enrolled, and we expect to report top-line data in the 3rd quarter of this year. Our 3rd and 4th indications are Bardet-Biedl and Alström syndromes. In contrast to the first 2 indications, which are genetically defined, these diseases are ciliopathies in which genetic defects in cellular cilia impact protein function in MC4 pathway genes. These disorders are syndromic, so patients suffer from additional comorbidities, additional phenotypic manifestations besides severe obesity and hyperphagia. And as a result, these populations are more readily identified. We've enrolled 9 patients with BBS in the Rhythm Basket study and 4 patients with Alström syndrome. Both of the patients shown here had very significant improvements in weight and hunger, a 26% reduction in the case of the first BBS patient, reduction in weight in that case, and a 21% reduction in the first AS patient. Interestingly, In the first Alstrom patient, an adolescent, his weight loss was significant enough that he reached ideal body weight for his age range, and his doctor has taken his dose lower while continuing to receive setmelanotide therapy. Our fifth indication in the Rhythm Basket study is is to study patients with heterozygous genetic mutations on one or more of MC4 pathway genes. Het obesity is a much more prevalent genetic condition. Estimates range from the mid-100,000s to the low millions, and these individuals have variable penetrance of obesity. In order to study this condition efficiently and to focus on the areas of highest unmet need, we're stratifying patients into cohorts in the Rhythm Basket study based on groupings of genetic variants. Our primary focus is on high-impact loss of function variants, a condition we estimate to impact upwards of 20,000 patients in the U.S. These patients have genetic variants such as truncations, frameshift mutations, splice mutations, as well as high-confidence published missense mutations. These patients present clinically in a fashion similar to our very severe homozygous deficient patients in POMC and LEPR. We're studying other subgroups of genetic variants as well, including variants which are not yet characterized, and we are seeking to characterize them directly using our own in vitro testing. In addition, we're studying patients with more than one variant and more than one gene in the MC4 pathway, a group we call composite heterozygous. Late last month, we showed initial results from our het obesity studies. Patients in the high-impact loss of function cohort are having a more consistent response to setmelanotide than patients in the other cohorts. Here you see the results of the first two high-impact LOF patients, both of whom have been on treatment for less than a year. The first patient having lost 9% of body weight and the second patient having lost 17% of body weight. We plan to continue enrolling patients across these various cohorts of het obesity and will provide more detailed updates on these studies in 2020. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Nithya Desikan, to talk more about setmelanotide and our plans for commercialization.
Thank you, Hunter. As you see here on this slide 13, the safety and tolerability of setmelanotide has been generally well established as we've evaluated setmelanotide in over 330 patients with obesity, and the first POMC patient studied in our phase 2 has now exceeded 4 years on treatment. We see that setmelanotide has been generally well tolerated. Most AEs are mild and resolve early in treatment. We've seen mild injection site reactions and often commonly darkening of the skin or tanning, and this is actually due to us hitting the closely related MC1 receptor, the natural tanning receptor. Those patients on drug see an effect as they would similarly to exposure to the sun, and they tan as a result. We do see that tanning is reversed as you take these patients off of drug. Discontinuations have been very rare, and we have not seen any increase in any of the cardiovascular parameters that were seen with previous drugs in this space. We have 3 ongoing pivotal phase 3 trials to study the first 4 indications, of which we have already established proof of concept: POMC deficient obesity, leptin receptor deficient obesity, Bardet-Biedl syndrome, and Alstrom syndrome. All of these pivotal trials actually share a common design in that we are studying patients above the age of 6 for a treatment duration of 1 year. They are all given daily subcutaneous injections, and the primary endpoint is a categorical analysis of responders, where a responder is defined as a 10% weight loss from baseline. We have key secondary endpoints that include mean weight loss, as well as many of the hunger parameters that we believe are critically important in helping to describe the burden of illness for these patients and the impact on their quality of life. We have supplemental patients that will continue to be enrolled beyond the pivotal cohorts to generate additional data, especially in those pediatric cohorts. The POMC and leptin receptor phase 3 trials, these are 2 distinct pivotal studies for each of those indications. They each have a pivotal cohort of 10 patients that are now fully enrolled, and we expect the top-line data to be released in the 3rd quarter of this year. For Bardet-Biedl syndrome and Alstrom syndrome, we have a combined phase 3 study. For these patients, because they're more readily diagnosed as a result of their symptoms, we have a slightly larger clinical study with a pivotal cohort of 30 patients where we have at least 20 Bardet-Biedl patients and 6 Alström patients in that pivotal cohort. In addition, we have included a 14-week placebo-controlled period followed by completion of an active open-label treatment duration to get to the 52 weeks of treatment, as we see that we have more of these patients available and can then help to separate to show the distinct effects of setmelanotide. We expect to complete pivotal enrollment of this phase 3 study by the end of this year. As Hunter mentioned, one of the most critical components of success for Rhythm is to help to build an integrated community for the treatment of rare genetic disorders of obesity. We are partnering with those clinicians and patients and caregivers in the community to help improve the evaluation and diagnosis and hopefully the ultimate treatment of these patients in the future. Slide 16 helps to show the market opportunity for these indications for which we have proof of concept. At the top of the slide, you can see that the distinct difference between POMC, leptin receptor deficiency, heterozygous obesity, and our syndromic is actually the way in which we can identify them in the population. On the upper left-hand corner, you see that for those patients with POMC, leptin receptor, and heterozygous deficiency obesity, the only way to truly identify them in the generally obese population is through genetic sequencing, as their symptoms mirror those of generally severe obese patients, with the hallmark symptoms of early onset obesity and hunger as the way in which these patients present. On the upper right-hand side, you see for Bardet-Biedl syndrome and Alström syndrome, because of the other symptoms that characterize these patients, they're more readily identifiable and are often already diagnosed and known to the medical system. For these two indications, there are already established registries, both in the U.S. and in Europe, that are studying these patients in their clinical course. In the middle of the slide, you see the clinical epidemiology for these indications that we're studying with setmelanotide. For POMC, leptin receptor deficiency, Bardet-Biedl, and Alström's, where we've already established proof of concept, we believe the estimates of the combined epidemiology support 5,000 patients in the U.S. and likely a similar number in Europe. On the right-hand side, you can see that for the subset of the heterozygous patients that we are studying, we believe that the high-impact loss of function subset could be as much as 20,000 patients in the U.S. We've also looked at genetic epidemiology, where we look at large databases of DNA, like the NOMAD database, which is approximately 140,000 sequenced samples in the U.S. And that supports that through modeling, we see a 5-fold increase above what the clinical epidemiology suggests in those estimates. And so we are very much looking forward to hopefully helping these patients become identified and ultimately treated with setmelanotide. Hunter mentioned the Rhythm engine, which is an integral part of the success of Rhythm and hopefully the successful treatment of these patients. We are dealing with very, very rare diseases, and so it's upon Rhythm to help to improve the evaluation and diagnosis and awareness among the entire community. We are doing that through a 3-pronged approach. At the top of the slide, you see the GO-ID study, which is our genotyping initiative, which is offered for suspected patients, either identified by their healthcare provider or the patient caregiver or patients themselves, self-identifying as their obesity being different than that of the general population, and we offer free sequencing to those individuals. As those patients are identified, they are either moved into the TEMPO registry, where we have a commitment to understanding the ongoing impact of those patients, or if we're studying their specific mutation for proof of concept, they would move into our basket study for phase 2 evaluation. This slide on 18 shows a little bit more detail about the expansion of our sequencing initiative, which we believe will help to increase the frequency of genetic testing by shifting the practice patterns of those physicians today. We are currently expecting an enrollment of 9,000 patients to be sequenced in this study over the next 18 months, and we've expanded the number of target centers to 140 centers worldwide. Our genotyping panel is now expanded to over 100 genes that are associated with obesity in the literature. Not all of these genes are implicated by the MC4R pathway, but we believe are a valuable tool in helping the community better understand genetic disorders of obesity. We also have initiated the TEMPO registry, which is focused on better understanding these rare genetic disorders of obesity. As these conditions are extremely rare, there was no natural history historically, and we believe it's critically important in our collaboration with this community to help better understand the clinical course and the impact of these diseases on these patients' lives. You can see on the right-hand side of this slide that there are a number of variants that we believe are genes that are implicated by this pathway that we think are important to better understand for this community. As those genes are studied for setmelanotide, we may also consider them for future indications. We have a target enrollment of 1,000 patients. These patients are identified, as I said, through the GO-ID study and then could potentially move into the basket study. 2019 and 2020 are going to be very exciting years for Rhythm. We are looking forward to seeing the top-line results of our first phase 3 pivotal studies for POMC deficiency and leptin receptor deficiency obesity in the third quarter of this year, and hope to then, very soon after, in the fourth quarter or first quarter of 2020, file those 2 filings for POMC and leptin receptor indications. We expect to complete enrollment of the Bardet-Biedl syndrome and Alström syndrome phase 3 study by the end of this year, and hope to also in this year update you on our ongoing efforts to increase patient identification, as well as additional disorders that we will be studying in our phase 2 study for future indications for setmelanotide beyond the 6 indications being studied today. We hope that in 2020 we'll be able to provide to you top-line data from our Bardet-Biedl and Alström phase 3 and provide additional updates on the heterozygous deficiency obesity patients as well. So very, very exciting years ahead for Rhythm. The last slide I want to talk to you about is to give you a sense of really what the impact is for these patients. I had the fortune of being able to go last summer to the Bardet-Biedl Family Association meeting where many families who have been diagnosed with Bardet-Biedl joined together as a community to help each other as they manage these disorders. This is Shawnee, a mother that I had the fortune of being able to meet last summer, and her daughter, Lucy. Shawnee described to us the impact of the obesity beyond what we might consider in terms of the comorbidity or difficulty for a child with that level of weight gain. I think the part that we want to try and help others to understand as we advocate for these patients is really the impact day to day on trying to control the hunger and the weight. You see here in the quote what an overwhelming task it is for her and her family, and you see her family down on the bottom right-hand side. In order to help Lucy really take control of the hunger and the overwhelming need to eat, for which really much of her happiness is dictated upon today. Lucy craves food day in and day out, and it is a significant burden for her, but also for her family as they try to manage her weight and her day-to-day life. So we are hopeful at Rhythm that we can have an impact on patients' lives, patients like Lucy and her family, her mother Shawnee, and other patients who we hopefully can both improve the evaluation and diagnosis so that they can get to better care, but also ultimately we hope to be able to treat with setmelanotide. Thank you very much. Yep, so I was just going to repeat the question since Alan doesn't have a microphone. So he too is excited about our data coming out in the third quarter for our first 2 indications and had asked specifically what are the preparatory stages at Rhythm for commercialization. A lot of our efforts are focused on driving disease awareness and education, which we really think is the most important part of building for commercial success. As you saw in the Rhythm Engine, we have an integrated process by which we believe we're going to help to shift the paradigm of these physicians and their thinking about a genetic cause for these patients. We also have initiatives focused on the patients and caregivers themselves. Many of these patients are actually the ones who are able to self-identify that their obesity, their hunger is in fact distinct from just the generally obese population. Patients and caregivers who have multiple children are able to see that the feeding patterns of these kids are very different than maybe their siblings. And so we're doing the work to help to integrate that communication so that both the physicians and the patients have greater awareness so that in connection through those conversations we can get to better diagnosis. We're also obviously building our teams in preparation for commercialization. Yeah, so as you know, the POMC and leptin receptor prevalence is quite small, so we expect a fairly small infrastructure at Rhythm from a field footprint perspective. When you look at the pediatric endocrinology population, that specialty is less than 2,000 patients, and so you would, specialists, physicians, and so you would expect a fairly small commercial footprint, obviously, to be able to target those clinicians. And then as we expand indications, we would expand the commercial strategies as well to be able to reach these broader populations. Yep. So the question was, how are we thinking about finding these patients and our level of confidence in the numbers? We're continuing to do the work to better understand these populations and the prevalence. The most important initiative is the GO-ID study, and what we're trying to do in that study is look at multiple algorithms by which we might become more efficient and better at finding these patients so that we can then go and teach the community how to do it as well. So the initial GO-ID study was focused on early onset obesity and hyperphagia, as those were the hallmark symptoms of most of our rare genetic disorders of obesity. We've actually added to that to look at other ways of thinking about finding patients to see if those circles basically would be enriched for these types of patients. So we're looking at high BMI, for instance. If you have a BMI over 50, if you have a BMI over 60, is it then more likely that we would find that those patients would be rare genetic disorder of obesity patients? We're also looking at where we might find them in the system, in the medical system. So, for instance, in bariatric surgery, looking at is that an enriched population, particularly in adolescent bariatric surgery, which unfortunately is happening more and more frequently in this country, that if you see a child that by the time they're 15, 16 years old are already considering bariatric surgery, might that be a population that might be more enriched for rare genetic disorders of obesity? And Alan, we do hope to give an update sometime later this year on how those patient identification initiatives are going.
Sure. So the question is really around additional indications besides our pivotal indications and the proof of concept studies that we're currently working on. So, and as you may recall, we recently announced updated data that we talked about in this presentation in high-impact heterozygous patients, or patients with high-impact loss-of-function variants in the different MC4 pathway genes. We're also studying POMC epigenetic deficiency obesity, although that study is progressing a little more slowly because it's concentrated in a single academic site, and it'll take some time for us to really evaluate, whether we want to add, for example, an epigenetic component to our sequencing efforts. We do expect to study a number of additional defects in targeted genes that are associated with the MC4R pathway, and we'll probably go into more detail about that as this year goes on. Today, we don't have anything new to say, however. Thanks very much, Alan, and we appreciate everyone's interest in Rhythm.